In the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan, in the smoke-filled social clubs of Greenwich Village, and along the working docks of the Hudson River, a secret government once operated in the open. It collected taxes that no law allowed. It enforced rules that no court had written. It handed down death sentences that no judge would ever review. For most of the 20th century, one organization sat at the very top of that hidden world, more powerful, more disciplined, and more carefully hidden than any of its rivals. The newspapers called it the most powerful mafia family in America. The men inside it preferred that no one talk about it at all. This is the story of the Genovese crime family, the organization that taught the American underworld how to rule from the shadows, and how that empire of silence finally cracked. To understand how the Genovese family rose, we have to go back to a time before it even carried that name, to a New York where the Italian underworld was tearing itself apart. In the late 1920s, organized crime in the city was not organized at all. It was a patchwork of competing gangs, divided by neighborhood, by region of origin, and by loyalty to old men who clung to an outdated idea of honor. Two of those old men would soon go to war. The first was Giuseppe Masseria, known on the street as Joe the Boss. He was heavy-set, crude, and greedy, and he commanded the largest gang in the city. The second was Salvatore Maranzano, a more educated and ambitious leader who had arrived from Sicily with dreams of building an empire modeled on the Roman legions he admired. Between these two ambitious men, there was no room for peace. The conflict that followed became known as the Castellammarese War, named for the Sicilian town that many of Maranzano's loyalists called home. For more than a year, gunmen stalked the streets of New York. Bodies turned up in cars, in restaurants, and in vacant lots. The killing was constant, expensive, and bad for business. And among the younger men forced to fight in this war, a new generation was watching, learning, and growing impatient. They saw two stubborn old bosses willing to bleed the entire underworld dry over questions of pride. These younger men did not care about the old country or its rituals. They cared about money, and they understood that endless war was the enemy of profit. The most important of these young men was Charles Luciano, a name that history would remember as Lucky Luciano. Luciano was sharp, calm under pressure, and ruthlessly practical. He served as a top lieutenant to Joe Masseria, but he had grown to despise the old man's stubbornness. Luciano had also built something rare for his era, friendships that crossed ethnic lines. He worked closely with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel, and he believed that crime should be run like a business, not like a blood feud. In the spring of 1931, Luciano made his move. He arranged a lunch with Joe Masseria at a restaurant in Coney Island. The two men ate, talked, and played cards. Then Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. While he was gone, gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Masseria dead at the table. With that single act of betrayal, the first old boss was gone, and the war was effectively over. Salvatore Maranzano had won. But Maranzano's victory would be brief. He gathered the families of New York and declared himself the boss of all bosses, the supreme leader of the entire Italian underworld. He divided the city's gangs into 5 organized families, each with its own territory and leadership. It was an impressive structure, but it had a fatal flaw. Maranzano had simply replaced one all-powerful old boss with another, and Luciano had not killed Masseria, only to bow before a new king. Maranzano sensed the danger. He drew up a list of rivals to be eliminated, and Luciano's name was near the top. But Luciano struck first. In September of 1931, a group of men posing as government agents entered Maranzano's office in Manhattan. They overpowered his bodyguards and killed him. In the space of a few months, both of the old bosses were dead, and the entire structure of the American Mafia was now in the hands of a new generation. What Luciano did next would shape organized crime for the rest of the century. Rather than crown himself the new boss of all bosses, he abolished the title completely. He understood that a single supreme leader made the whole organization unstable, because every ambitious man would always be plotting to take the throne. Instead, Luciano created a governing body, a board of directors for the underworld. He called it the Commission. The Commission was made up of the bosses of the most powerful families, primarily the 5 families of New York, along with leaders from Chicago and Buffalo. Disputes between families would be settled by negotiation and vote, not by gunfire. Major decisions, especially the assassination of a boss, required the Commission's approval. It was a system designed to bring peace, stability, and above all, profit. And at the head of one of those 5 families stood Lucky Luciano himself, leading the organization that would one day be known as the Genovese crime family. For a few short years, Luciano sat at the summit of this new criminal order. His family controlled gambling, loan sharking, and a growing network of rackets across the city. But Luciano's reign at the top was cut short not by a bullet, but by a courtroom. A determined prosecutor named Thomas Dewey targeted him relentlessly, and in 1936, Luciano was convicted on charges related to organized prostitution and sentenced to a long term in prison. Even behind bars, he tried to direct his empire. But a boss in a cell cannot rule forever. Luciano's story did not end in that prison cell, and the strange path it took only added to his legend. During the Second World War, with the nation fearful of sabotage on its docks, the government reportedly reached a quiet understanding with the imprisoned crime boss, seeking his influence over the waterfront unions to help guard against enemy agents. Whether the arrangement accomplished much remains debated, but it earned Luciano a measure of goodwill. After the war, his sentence was commuted on the condition that he leave the country forever. In 1946, Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy, the land of his birth. From across the ocean, he would continue to cast a long shadow over the family he had founded, advising, scheming, and according to legend, helping to engineer the downfall of those who later betrayed his principles. But with the founder gone overseas, the daily rule of the organization fell to other hands. With Luciano locked away and then exiled, the family needed someone to run its day-to-day affairs, and that man was Frank Costello. Costello was unlike the stereotype of the violent gangster. He was smooth, diplomatic, and politically connected. He preferred bribery to bloodshed and influence to intimidation. Through years of careful cultivation, Costello had built relationships with judges, politicians, and police officials throughout New York. The newspapers gave him a fitting nickname. They called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Under Costello's leadership, the family reached new heights of wealth and influence. His gambling and slot machine operations stretched far beyond New York, and his political connections gave the organization a layer of protection that money alone could not buy. Costello understood the deepest secret of the Genovese family's success, that real power did not come from being feared on the street, it came from being invisible to the law while quietly controlling the people who enforced it. For a time, it seemed that Frank Costello might rule in peace, but a shadow from the past was about to return, and his name was Vito Genovese. Vito Genovese was the man who would eventually give the family its lasting name, and he was everything Frank Costello was not. Where Costello was diplomatic, Genovese was ferocious, ambitious, and consumed by a hunger for power. He had risen alongside Luciano in the early days, and he believed that he, not Costello, was the rightful heir to the family's throne. But in the late 1930s, Genovese had been forced to flee the United States to avoid prosecution for a murder, and he had spent the war years in Italy, where he reportedly cultivated ties with powerful figures of the era before shifting his loyalties as the tide turned. When Vito Genovese finally returned to the United States after the war, he found his old organization being run by a man he considered beneath him. The murder charge against him collapsed when a key witness conveniently died in custody, and Genovese walked free. He immediately set about reclaiming what he believed was his. The stage was now set for a struggle at the very top of the American underworld, a quiet, deadly contest between the diplomat Frank Costello and the warlord Vito Genovese. For years, the two men maneuvered against each other, building alliances and probing for weakness. Genovese knew he could not simply seize control. Frank Costello was respected, connected, and protected by powerful friends on the commission. To take the throne, Genovese would have to break the rules that Luciano had written. He decided that Costello had to die. On a spring evening in 1957, Frank Costello returned to his Manhattan apartment building. As he walked through the lobby, a large man stepped out of the shadows behind him. The gunman called out, telling Costello that this was for him, and fired. The bullet struck Costello in the head, but in a stroke of extraordinary luck, it only grazed his scalp, traveling around his skull rather than into it. Costello survived. The shooter, a rising young soldier in the family, fled the scene. His name was Vincent Gigante, and he would one day become the most important figure in the family's entire history. But on that night, he was simply the man who had failed to kill Frank Costello. The botched assassination changed everything. Frank Costello understood the message perfectly. He had been marked for death, and the man behind it was Vito Genovese. Rather than fight a war he was likely to lose, the Prime Minister of the Underworld made a quiet decision. He stepped aside. Costello retired from the leadership of the family, surrendering control to his rival in exchange for his life. Vito Genovese had won, and from this moment forward, the organization that Luciano had built would carry the name of the man who seized it. It became the Genovese crime family. Genovese moved quickly to consolidate his power. Just months after the attempt on Costello, another of the city's most feared bosses, Albert Anastasia, was gunned down while sitting in a barber's chair in a Manhattan hotel. Anastasia had been an ally of Costello and an obstacle to Genovese's ambitions. With his death, the last major check on Vito Genovese's power was gone. He now stood at the absolute summit of the American Mafia, the boss of the most powerful family in the most powerful city in the underworld. To confirm his new status, Genovese called for a grand meeting of mafia leaders from across the country. In November of 1957, dozens of the nation's most powerful crime bosses traveled to a quiet rural estate in the small town of Apalachin in upstate New York. They came to recognize Genovese's authority and to settle the affairs of the underworld. It was meant to be a private gathering, hidden from the world. Instead, it became one of the greatest disasters in mafia history. A local police officer noticed the unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state license plates gathering at the rural home. Suspicious, he called for backup and set up a checkpoint. When the lawman approached, panic erupted. Dozens of the most powerful gangsters in America fled into the woods in their fine suits and silk ties, scrambling through fields and tearing their clothes on barbed wire fences. Many were caught and identified. The Apalachin meeting was a catastrophe. For decades, law enforcement leaders, including the head of the federal government's own investigative bureau, had insisted that no national crime syndicate even existed. Now the entire country had proof, splashed across the front pages, that a secret criminal organization spanned the nation. The mafia could no longer hide behind the myth that it did not exist. The disaster at Apalachin marked the beginning of the end for Vito Genovese personally, even as the family he named was just reaching its peak. In 1959, only 2 years after seizing power, Genovese was convicted on narcotics trafficking charges and sentenced to a long term in federal prison. According to a story that has circulated for decades among those who study the mafia, Genovese may have been the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. The theory holds that his old rivals, the men he had threatened and betrayed, including figures connected to Luciano and Costello, arranged to have him framed and removed from power. Whether the conspiracy was real or not, the result was the same. The man who had clawed his way to the top of the underworld would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Vito Genovese died in prison in 1969, still officially the boss of the family that carried his name. By the time of Genovese's imprisonment, the family had grown into something remarkable. It was widely regarded as the most powerful and the most sophisticated of the 5 families of New York. Within the underworld, it earned a respectful nickname. People called it the Ivy League of the Mafia, a reference to its discipline, its secrecy, and its refusal to engage in the kind of reckless violence and publicity that brought down lesser organizations. The source of the Genovese family's power lay in its iron control over essential industries. Nowhere was this more visible than on the waterfront. For much of the 20th century, the docks of New York and New Jersey were among the busiest in the world, and the unions that controlled the dock workers were dominated by the Genovese family. Nothing moved across those piers without the family taking its share. Every crate, every shipment, every job on the waterfront could be taxed by men loyal to the organization. This control over the flow of goods gave the family enormous leverage over legitimate businesses across the entire region. But the waterfront was only the beginning. The family extended its grip into the construction industry, into trucking, into private garbage collection, and into the wholesale food markets that fed the city. It infiltrated labor unions and used them as weapons, threatening strikes and slowdowns that could cripple a business overnight unless the owners paid for labor peace. It ran illegal gambling operations that took in staggering sums, and it loaned money at brutal interest rates to those who had nowhere else to turn. The Genovese family had perfected a model in which crime and legitimate business became so deeply intertwined that it was almost impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The reach of this control could be seen in the everyday life of the city, hidden in plain sight. At the Great Fulton Fish Market, the family for decades collected its tribute from the merchants and haulers who supplied seafood to restaurants across the region, so that the cost of a fish dinner carried a hidden tax paid to the underworld. In the construction trade, the family was a key partner in a secret cartel that rigged the bidding on major projects, quietly deciding which companies would win contracts and adding millions to the cost of buildings that rose across the skyline. Even the beloved street festivals of Little Italy, with their lights and music and crowds, were said to channel money toward the organization. The Genovese family did not simply commit crimes against the city. It had embedded itself into the very machinery of how the city was built, fed, and entertained, taking its cut at every turn, while most people never suspected a thing. Yet for all this wealth and power, the family's true genius lay in how it protected its leaders. The men who ran the Genovese organization had learned a painful lesson from the past. Bosses who stood in the spotlight, who let the newspapers print their names and the prosecutors learn their faces, did not last. So the family developed a defense more sophisticated than any other in the underworld. It built a wall of deception around its true leadership. It created the strategy of the front boss. The idea was elegant and deceptive. The family would allow one man to appear to be the boss, to be seen, to be talked about, to draw the attention of law enforcement. Meanwhile, the real boss, the man who actually gave the orders, would remain hidden, often pretending to be a lower-ranking figure or even a humble retiree. For decades, this strategy left investigators chasing the wrong men, building cases against decoys while the true power stayed beyond their reach. Among the men who guided the family through this era of hidden power was Philip Lombardo, a quiet and careful boss who understood the value of staying out of sight. And serving as one of the most famous front men in Mafia history was a stocky, cigar-chewing figure named Tony Salerno, known to everyone as Fat Tony. With his battered hat and ever-present cigar, Fat Tony Salerno looked exactly like the public imagined a mafia boss should look. He held court at a social club in East Harlem, and his reputation grew so large that a major magazine once identified him as one of the most powerful and wealthiest gangsters in America. Law enforcement believed for years that Fat Tony Salerno was the boss of the Genovese family. They were wrong. Salerno was important, powerful, and deeply involved in the family's affairs. But the man who truly sat at the top was someone the public had nearly forgotten. The very same soldier who had once failed to kill Frank Costello in that apartment lobby. Vincent Gigante. Vincent Gigante, known throughout the underworld as the Chin, would become the most cunning and the most bizarre boss in the history of the American Mafia. A former boxer from Greenwich Village, Gigante had risen steadily through the ranks after his early days as a gunman. By the 1980s, he had quietly maneuvered himself into position as the true boss of the Genovese family. But unlike the proud public bosses of the past, Gigante took the family's strategy of secrecy to an extreme that no one had ever attempted. He decided that the best way to avoid prison was to convince the entire world that he was insane. For years, the people of Greenwich Village grew accustomed to a strange sight. An old man in a tattered bathrobe and slippers would shuffle through the streets, unshaven and muttering to himself, sometimes mumbling nonsense, sometimes appearing to talk to no one at all. To the casual observer, he was a harmless, mentally ill neighborhood figure. The newspapers gave him a nickname that captured the bizarre performance perfectly. They called him the Oddfather. But this shuffling, muttering old man was in fact the supreme leader of the most powerful criminal organization in America, issuing orders through a network of trusted relatives and captains, and personally approving acts of violence across the city. Gigante's performance was relentless and total. He checked himself into psychiatric hospitals repeatedly over the years, collecting diagnoses that his lawyers could wave in front of any judge who dared to bring him to trial. Whenever prosecutors moved against him, his attorneys argued that the poor, confused old man was far too mentally ill to understand the charges or to assist in his own defense. For an astonishing length of time, the act worked. The Chin avoided trial after trial by hiding behind a mask of madness, all while running a criminal empire worth untold millions. It was perhaps the most audacious deception in the entire history of organized crime. But even as Vincent Gigante perfected his strange masquerade, the ground was shifting beneath the entire American Mafia. The very secrecy that had protected the families for generations was about to be stripped away, not by a lucky police officer at a rural farmhouse, but by a powerful new weapon in the hands of federal prosecutors. That weapon was a law, and it would change everything. The law was the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known by its initials as RICO. Passed years earlier, but only fully unleashed against the Mafia in the 1980s, RICO allowed prosecutors to do something they had never been able to do before. Instead of charging gangsters with individual crimes, one murder or one act of extortion at a time, RICO let them put an entire criminal organization on trial as a single ongoing enterprise. A boss who had never personally pulled a trigger could now be convicted for ordering the crimes of his organization. The wall of deniability that had protected the leadership for half a century was about to come crashing down. The most dramatic use of this new weapon came in the middle of the 1980s, in a case that became known as the Mafia Commission Trial. A team of federal prosecutors, led by an aggressive young attorney named Rudolph Giuliani, set out to do the impossible. They aimed to convict not just individual gangsters, but the leadership of the commission itself, the governing body that Lucky Luciano had created decades earlier. The prosecution argued that the commission was a criminal enterprise and that its members were responsible for the crimes carried out under its authority. Among the defendants in that historic trial was Tony Salerno, the cigar-chewing front boss who the government still believed was the true head of the Genovese family. The evidence gathered through years of secret recordings and surveillance was overwhelming. In 1986, the verdicts came down. The bosses of the commission were convicted, and the sentences were staggering. Fat Tony Salerno and the other aging leaders received prison terms of 100 years. It was a catastrophic blow to the American Mafia, a public demonstration that even the highest leaders of the underworld were no longer beyond the reach of the law. And yet, in a final twist that revealed the brilliance of the Genovese family's strategy, the government had once again convicted the wrong man at the top. They had sent Fat Tony Salerno away as the boss of the family, but Salerno had been a front all along. The true boss, Vincent the Chin Gigante, was still free, still shuffling through Greenwich Village in his bathrobe, still pretending to be a confused old man, while his rivals went to prison in his place. The Oddfather had survived the greatest assault on the Mafia in American history, but the law was patient and it was closing in. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, federal investigators slowly built their case against Gigante. They gathered testimony, recordings, and the accounts of former associates who had begun to break the ancient code of silence. The most damaging blow came as the Mafia's own members started to cooperate with the government. Men who had once sworn never to betray the organization now sat in courtrooms and described, in detail, how the shuffling madman of Greenwich Village had ordered murders and ruled the family with absolute authority. Gigante's lawyers fought desperately to keep the insanity defense alive, parading psychiatric reports and arguing that their client was incompetent to stand trial. But the mountain of evidence proving that the act was a calculated deception finally became too high to ignore. In 1997, Vincent Gigante was brought to trial, convicted of racketeering and conspiracy, and sentenced to prison. The mask of madness had finally been torn away. Even then, the Chin clung to his performance, continuing the charade from behind prison walls. But in 2003, in a final and stunning admission, Vincent Gigante stood in a courtroom and confessed that his decades of apparent insanity had been a fraud, a deliberate ruse designed to evade justice. The greatest deception in the history of the American Mafia was over. Vincent the Chin Gigante, the Oddfather, the last great boss of the old Genovese family, died in prison in 2005. The fall of Gigante marked the end of an era, not only for the Genovese family, but for the traditional American Mafia as a whole. The combination of the RICO law, relentless federal prosecution, and the collapse of the Code of Silence had shattered the empire that Luciano had built. One by one, the great bosses of the five families were sent to prison or buried. The commission that had once governed a hidden nation was broken. The age of the celebrity gangster, of the public boss holding court in his social club, was over. And yet the Genovese family did not vanish. Of all the five families of New York, it proved to be the most resilient, precisely because it had always been the most secretive. While other families tore themselves apart in violent succession wars and saw their secrets spilled by a flood of informants, the Genovese organization survived by doing what it had always done best: staying quiet, staying hidden, and trusting no one. Law enforcement officials came to regard it as the most powerful and the most disciplined of the surviving families, an organization that had learned the hard lessons of the past and refused to repeat the mistakes that had destroyed its rivals. In the years that followed, the family operated with extreme caution. Leadership reportedly passed to careful, low-profile figures who avoided the spotlight entirely, men who issued no grand statements and held no public court. The rackets continued, quieter now and more carefully concealed, woven into the legitimate economy of the city. The family had retreated deeper into the shadows than ever before, a faded but persistent presence in the underworld it had once ruled. So what is the legacy of the Genovese crime family? It is, in many ways, the story of the American Mafia itself, told through its most powerful and most secretive branch. It began in the chaos of a gang war and rose through the cold genius of men who understood that crime was a business and that violence was merely a tool. It built a system of governance, the Commission, that brought a brutal kind of order to the underworld. It mastered the art of hiding its leaders behind walls of deception, from front bosses to a man pretending to be insane. And it learned more thoroughly than any of its rivals that the greatest power belongs to those who are never seen. But the family's story is also a lesson in the limits of that power. For all its discipline and secrecy, for all its control over the waterfront and the unions and the markets, it could not hide forever. The same law that it had subverted for generations eventually evolved into a weapon that no amount of cunning could defeat. The bathrobe and the muttering, the front bosses and the silence, all of it bought time. But in the end, the wall came down. The empire of shadows that Lucky Luciano had founded and Vito Genovese had seized was, like every empire built on fear and secrecy, destined to fall. Today, the great social clubs are mostly closed, the legendary bosses are gone, and the waterfront empire is a memory. The Genovese crime family endures only as a diminished echo of what it once was, a name whispered in courtrooms and history books rather than feared on the streets. But its rise and fall left a permanent mark on the American story, a reminder of how a secret government once operated in the heart of the nation's greatest city, and of how, for nearly a century, the most powerful men in the underworld ruled not by being seen, but by disappearing into the shadows.